The hum of the Seraph's engines was the only sound in the command room, a quiet reminder that they were still alive, for now. Captain Alex Carter stood at the helm, her eyes locked onto the holographic display in front of her. The Draxari fleet was fast approaching, their ships forming a dark, menacing cloud in the distance. The odds were grim. The Seraph was the last human ship standing, and its crew was vastly outnumbered. It felt like the end. "Captain, they're getting closer," Lieutenant Jacobs said from his station, his voice tense as his fingers danced over the controls. "We can't outrun them. They've got us cornered. What's the plan?" Carter didn't respond immediately. She had faced battles before, hard, brutal fights that left scars both on the body and in the soul. But this was different. The Draxari weren't just invaders. They were conquerors. Ruthless and merciless, they had wiped out entire civilizations without a second thought. Earth was next, and there was no escaping that fate unless they fought back. Her hands gripped the control panel in front of her, the only thing keeping her grounded as her mind raced. "We don't run," she said, her voice calm but filled with an iron resolve. "We fight." Jacobs blinked in disbelief. "Fight? Captain, we're outnumbered 5-1. Our weapons systems are limited, and we don't have enough firepower to take on their fleet head-to-head. We'll be wiped out before we even get a chance." Carter's gaze never left the screen. Her fingers moved over the control panel, sending commands to the crew and preparing the ship for battle. "That's what they want us to believe, that we're weak, that we're nothing." She turned, her eyes locking onto the faces of her crew. They were all young, too young to face an army like the Draxari, but they had something the enemy didn't: heart. The will to fight, even when everything seemed impossible. "We are not nothing," Carter said, her voice rising with fierce passion. "We've survived this long, and we're not going to let them take Earth without a fight. We're human. We don't give up. We don't back down." The crew exchanged looks, some filled with fear, others with determination. They had all signed up for this mission, to explore the stars, to bring humanity into the galactic fold. But none of them had signed up for this. None of them had expected a full-scale invasion. "We've been through worse," Carter continued, her voice steady and strong. "We've survived the worst of what the universe has thrown at us, and we're still standing. I will not let them take Earth without making them regret it." A silence fell over the room as her words settled in. Carter knew they were scared. They had every right to be. The Draxari had wiped out entire planets without hesitation. But she also knew that if they stood and fought, if they showed the galaxy what humanity was made of, they might just stand a chance. "Captain," Jacob said, his voice softer now, "you're right. We don't back down." The words carried weight. They weren't just words of support, they were a pledge to fight, to survive. "Prepare the weapons," Carter said. "We're not going down without a fight." The tension in the command room was thick as the Draxari ships neared. The crew worked quickly, pulling together all their remaining resources. Every person had a job to do, whether it was manning the weapons, maintaining the ship's shields, or preparing for whatever came next. Carter stood at the front of the room, her hands tight on the controls. The Seraph wasn't a warship. It was an exploration vessel, designed for peaceful missions, not for war. But it was all they had, and she wasn't going to let it go down without making a statement. The Draxari fleet, massive and overwhelming, filled the view screen. Their ships were dark, sleek, and heavily armed. They were built for destruction, and they weren't stopping until they had wiped humanity off the map. A chill ran through Carter's spine, but she refused to let it show. She had faced death before, but never like this. She wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be, not when so many were depending on her. "Captain," Lieutenant Ramirez called from the weapons station, "we're ready to fire, but we're not going to make a dent in their fleet with these weapons. We need a plan." Carter nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. They didn't have the firepower to match the Draxari head-to-head. They would have to outsmart them. The Draxari relied on brute force, on overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers. But humanity had one thing the Draxari didn't: adaptability, the ability to think on their feet. "We can't go toe-to-toe with them," Carter said, her mind racing as she considered their options. "But we can make them think we're a bigger threat than we are. We hit their flagship first. If we take out their command center, we might throw the rest of their fleet into chaos." "We'll have to get close enough to target their weak spots," Jacobs added, already adjusting the ship's trajectory. "But that means putting ourselves in the line of fire." Carter glanced at the viewscreen once more. The Draxari were getting closer, their ships forming a deadly formation. The Seraph was outgunned and outmatched, but Carter didn't care. She wasn't going to let them take Earth, not without showing them just what humanity was capable of. She turned to her crew, her voice fierce. "We're doing this together. No matter what happens, we fight. We show them how humanity does battle." The crew nodded, each of them steeling themselves for the challenge ahead. The Draxari fleet continued to advance, but Carter had a plan. It was risky, it was desperate, but it was the only chance they had. And if they were going to go down, they would do it on their terms. As the enemy ships grew closer, Carter gave the order: "Target their flagship. Fire." The hum of the Seraph's engines intensified as it surged forward, closing the distance between them and the Draxari fleet. Captain Alex Carter's hands gripped the control panel with an intensity that mirrored the tension in the air. Every heartbeat seemed to echo in the cold vastness of space as the moment of truth drew closer. "Captain, they're charging their weapons," Jacobs warned, his voice tight with urgency. The Draxari ships were surrounding them now, their massive hulls casting shadows over the Seraph, a symbol of overwhelming power. Carter glanced at the screen, watching the enemy fleet like a storm approaching. She could feel the pressure mounting on her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had to stay focused. "How much time do we have?" "Less than 5 minutes before they're in range," Jacobs replied. "We can't avoid the first wave. We'll have to absorb it." Her mind raced. They couldn't outrun them, couldn't overpower them, but they could still strike first. The Draxari were used to overwhelming their enemies, making quick, decisive attacks. The Seraph wasn't fast enough to dodge, and its weapons weren't strong enough for a direct fight, but Carter wasn't looking for a fair battle. She was looking for a way to turn the tide. "We hit them fast, we hit them hard," she said, her voice clear, filled with determination. "Target the lead ship's bridge. We've got one shot at this. Take it." The room fell silent for a moment, the crew nodding in understanding. The Seraph wasn't built for this kind of battle, but they weren't about to let the Draxari steamroll them. Ramirez, the weapons officer, adjusted the ship's targeting system, making quick calculations. "Ready, Captain," Ramirez said, his fingers poised over the fire controls. His eyes flicked toward the viewscreen where the Draxari flagship loomed larger with each passing second. It was a monstrous vessel, its surface glinting in the light of distant stars. It was the heart of the fleet, the command ship. If they could disable it, the Draxari would be thrown into disarray. "Fire!" Carter shouted. The Seraph's cannons flared to life. A stream of blue energy shot forward, cutting through the emptiness of space. The shot struck the Draxari flagship, hitting its forward shields. Sparks and debris erupted from the ship's surface, and for a moment it seemed like the Draxari were stunned. But the flagship wasn't disabled. Its shields held, and its weapons systems powered up immediately, returning fire with deadly precision. The Seraph shook violently as the blast struck their shields, knocking the crew off balance. The ship groaned under the pressure, and alarms blared as the shields began to flicker. "Shields at 20%, Jacobs yelled, his voice strained as he fought to stabilize the ship. "Get us closer," Carter ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. She wasn't about to back down. If they were going to die today, it wasn't going to be without making the Draxari feel it. Jacobs adjusted the ship's trajectory, pushing the engines to their limit as they closed in on the enemy flagship. "We'll be in range in 30 seconds. "Do whatever it takes to keep us from blowing up before then," Carter replied. The ship rocked again, another Draxari blast hitting their weakened shields. The Seraph was barely holding together, but they were close. They were almost there. Carter's eyes narrowed. This was it. They were about to throw everything they had at the heart of the Draxari fleet, and if they failed, Earth would fall. But if they succeeded, they could make the Draxari think twice about their invasion. "Ramirez, target the engines," Carter commanded. "Take them out now." Ramirez hesitated for a fraction of a second before firing. The Seraph's guns roared again, this time striking the engines of the Draxari flagship. The impact was immediate. The flagship shuddered, its engines sputtering as it began to drift, losing its momentum. "We got it," Ramirez shouted, his voice a mixture of excitement and relief. Carter's eyes were fixed on the screen, watching as the Draxari flagship struggled to regain control. But just as she began to feel a sense of victory, the rest of the Draxari fleet opened fire. The blasts came from all directions, striking the Seraph with brutal force. The ship lurched, and the lights flickered. The crew braced themselves, holding on to whatever they could as the ship groaned under the pressure. "We're taking fire from all sides," Jacobs called out, his voice full of panic. "Shields are failing. We can't take another hit like that." Carter's heart raced. They couldn't afford to be overwhelmed. The Draxari were relentless, and now that their flagship was disabled, the rest of the fleet would turn on them with everything they had. "Focus on evasion," Carter said, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos. "Jacobs, move us through the debris field. We'll use it as cover." The asteroid field ahead of them loomed like a vast labyrinth of jagged rocks. It was dangerous, but it was their only hope. The Seraph wasn't fast enough to outrun the Draxari, but the debris field could shield them from direct fire, at least for a while. Jacobs didn't hesitate. "Aye, Captain, taking evasive action now." The ship veered hard to the left, dodging a plasma blast that would have destroyed them. The hull screeched as it narrowly missed a massive asteroid, the rocks flying in all directions as they zoomed through the field. "Steady," Carter said through gritted teeth. She could feel the weight of the ship's struggle to stay in motion. They had to survive long enough for the Draxari to make a mistake, to get one opening, one chance. The Draxari ships were now in hot pursuit, their weapons firing relentlessly. The asteroid field seemed to stretch endlessly before them, but Carter knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Their shields were practically gone, and the Seraph was already on the brink of falling apart. "Captain," Jacobs cried, his eyes wide. "We're running out of time. The fleet's closing in." Carter's mind raced. They had one shot. "Ramirez," she said, her voice calm but urgent, "fire the last of our disruptor charges. We need to disable their weapon systems." Ramirez didn't hesitate. The disruptor charges were a last resort, their power limited. If they didn't succeed now, they were done for. Firing now. The disruptor blast shot forward, striking one of the Draxari ships with pinpoint accuracy. The ship's weapons systems flickered, then went dark. Another ship followed suit, then another. One by one, the Draxari ships began to lose power. "We've done it," Ramirez said, his voice full of disbelief. "They're retreating." The Draxari fleet, once relentless in its pursuit, began to break formation, their ships drifting away as their systems failed. Carter's hands were still gripped tight on the control panel as she watched the enemy fleet retreat, their once dominant ships now helpless. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the tension in the room began to ease. The Seraph had won, but only just. The ship was damaged beyond repair, and the crew was battered, but they had done it. They had made the Draxari realize that humanity wouldn't go down quietly. Carter stood tall, the weight of their victory sinking in. "Status report," she said, her voice steady. "We've won, Captain," Jacobs replied. "The fleet is retreating. The Seraph is still intact for now, but we're going to need repairs." Carter nodded, her eyes scanning the viewscreen. They had survived, but this battle was only the beginning. "Start the repairs," Carter said, her voice low. "And let's send a message to Earth. The galaxy knows we're here now, and we're not going anywhere." Silence in the control room was deafening. The chaos of battle had faded into the background, leaving only the hum of the Seraph's engines and the soft beeping of the ship's systems. The crew was exhausted, their faces pale from the tension of the battle. Some were still tending to the wounded, others working tirelessly to keep the ship intact. But Captain Alex Carter stood at the helm, staring out into the void of space, where the remnants of the Draxari fleet could still be seen drifting, their ships crippled but not yet fully defeated. "Captain," Jacob said, his voice breaking the silence, "we've made it, but barely. The ship's holding together for now, but we're running low on resources. Shields are offline and weapons are down to 30%. Carter nodded, feeling the weight of the words. They had won, but the victory had come at a heavy cost. The Seraph was barely functional and the crew had only narrowly survived the battle. The Draxari were a relentless enemy, and though they had retreated for now, they wouldn't stay away for long. They would come back, and next time they wouldn't be caught off guard. "We can't afford to rest," Carter said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "The Draxari will regroup and they'll send reinforcements. We need to make repairs and be ready to fight again." Jacobs looked at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion. "Captain, we've fought for hours and the crew is stretched thin. We need rest. We need time to recover." "I know," Carter replied, her tone softer now, "but we don't have the luxury of time. Earth is counting on us. If we don't keep fighting, if we don't push back, we lose everything." She turned away from the screen, looking at her crew. Each one of them had given everything they had. Their hands were bruised, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. But there was a fire in their eyes, a spark that told Carter they weren't ready to give up. She took a deep breath. "We'll do everything we can, we'll fix the ship, we'll rest, but we won't stop until we've shown the Draxari that Earth isn't a target to be wiped out. We fight for Earth, we fight for each other." There was a quiet moment, a moment of unity. Then, slowly, one by one, the crew nodded. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting for something bigger. They were fighting to prove that humanity wasn't going to be wiped out without a fight. The hours that followed were grueling. The crew worked tirelessly to repair the ship systems. The engineering bay was a flurry of activity, with technicians scrambling to patch up the Seraph's hull, restore the weapons systems, and reroute power to the most critical systems. Ramirez, the weapons officer, worked alongside the engineers, making sure the ship's remaining guns were operational. Carter moved through the corridors, offering words of encouragement to her crew. She knew how much they had given, but they were all pulling together. They were doing the impossible, keeping the ship running on minimal resources, holding their ground in the face of a much stronger enemy. In the crew's mess hall, Leela Carter, the ship's scientist, sat with her team, poring over data. They had recovered fragments of Draxari technology during the battle, pieces of their ships that had been destroyed in the conflict. Leela's mind raced as she examined them, looking for any advantage they could gain from the alien tech. "Captain," Leela said as Carter entered the room, her voice filled with excitement, "I think we have something here. It's not much, but we might be able to reverse engineer some of their weapon systems. If we can adapt them, we'll have a fighting chance." Carter's eyes lit up. "How long until we can make it work?" Leela hesitated, her brow furrowing in thought. "It'll take time, maybe a few days. We need to study their tech in depth and make adjustments to fit our systems, but it could give us the edge we need." Carter nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. Every second counted, and they didn't have the luxury of time. But this was the kind of thing humanity did best: adapt, innovate, and push forward no matter the odds. "We'll make it work," Carter said firmly. "Keep at it. Do whatever you can. We need every advantage we can get." Leela smiled, her eyes gleaming with determination. "We won't let you down, Captain." The next day, as the crew continued their work, Carter found herself standing alone in the observation deck. The stars stretched out before her, vast and endless. Earth was somewhere far behind, a tiny speck in the infinite universe. The weight of responsibility hung on her shoulders. She had led them into battle and won, but the war was far from over. The Draxari would return. They wouldn't stop until they had Earth under their control. "Captain," Jacob said, his voice breaking through her thoughts, "the Seraph is as ready as it can be. We've got power rerouted to the weapons and shields, and Leela's team has made some headway with the Draxari tech. It's not perfect, but it's something." Carter turned to face him, nodding. "Good. We'll need every advantage we can get." "You've got a plan, right?" Jacobs asked, his tone hesitant. "I mean, we can't just keep running or hiding. The Draxari won't stop." Carter looked out at the stars once more, the weight of the question pressing down on her. She had a plan, but it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be clean, but it was the only way. "We fight, we strike when they least expect it. We use what we've got and we hit them hard." Jacobs nodded, understanding the weight of her words. They didn't have a choice. They had to fight, not just for survival, but for the future of Earth, for the future of humanity. "We'll need to move quickly," Carter continued, her voice steady. "We can't let them regroup. We hit them now, before they have a chance to call for reinforcements. We show them what humanity can do when pushed to the brink." Jacob smiled, a fierce determination in his eyes. "I'm with you, Captain, we all are." Carter turned to face him, her eyes filled with pride. "Then let's get to work. We'll show them what happens when you underestimate humanity." Hours later, the Seraph was ready for its next move. The crew, though battered and exhausted, had pulled together. They were united, focused, and determined. They were going to make the Draxari feel the sting of their defiance. Carter sat in the command chair, her hands gripping the armrests. The crew was ready. The ship was ready. The time had come. "Let's do this," Carter said, her voice steady and filled with resolve. "Engage the Draxari fleet. Show them how humanity fights." With that, the Seraph surged forward, cutting through the darkness of space. They were about to strike back, and this time the galaxy would know humanity wasn't going down without a fight. The Seraph sliced through space with a new purpose. Its engines hummed, its weapons primed, and the crew was united by a single goal: to hit the Draxari fleet hard before they could recover. Captain Alex Carter stood at the helm, her grip tight on the control panel. The tension in the air was palpable, but she refused to let fear take hold. This was their moment to strike back, and she wasn't going to waste it. "Captain," Jacobs called from his station, his voice tight with focus. "We've picked up Draxari ships on long-range scanners. They're regrouping, but they're still disorganized. We've got a window of opportunity." Carter's eyes narrowed as she studied the holographic display in front of her. The Draxari fleet was scattered, some of their ships limping from the previous battle, their systems struggling to stay operational. It was a weakness, one they couldn't afford to waste. "This is our chance," she said, her voice calm but filled with the steel that had carried her through every trial. "Ramirez, are the new weapon systems ready?" "Aye, Captain," Ramirez replied, his eyes glowing with determination. "We've integrated the Draxari tech, and it's working better than expected. The disruptor beams are fully operational." Carter felt a surge of hope. The Draxari's own technology had been their enemy's downfall, but now it was their weapon, their advantage. Humanity had always adapted, always found a way when things seemed impossible. Now it was time to use that spirit to fight back. "Good," Carter said. "All hands brace for impact, we're going in." The crew responded without hesitation, every member of the Seraph ready for the fight ahead. Carter's heart beat faster as the ship surged forward, the Draxari fleet now clearly visible ahead. She knew the stakes. If they failed here, if they didn't strike while the Draxari were vulnerable, humanity's future could be lost. There was no turning back. The Seraph cut through the remaining debris from the previous battle, weaving skillfully between the wreckage of the Draxari ships. They were still reeling from their earlier losses, and Carter knew they couldn't hold it together for long. But even weakened, the Draxari were dangerous. Their sheer numbers could overwhelm them if they weren't careful. "Prepare to fire," Carter ordered, her voice sharp. The tension in the room was like a taut wire, each person on edge, waiting for the order. "Target the lead ship," she commanded as the first Draxari vessel came into range. Their flagship, still reeling from the earlier strike, was the perfect target. If they could take it down, they would throw the rest of the fleet into chaos. "Firing disruptor beam," Ramirez called, his fingers flying across the controls. The ship rocked slightly as the disruptor beam fired. A brilliant pulse of energy shot forward, striking the Draxari flagship. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the flagship's engines sputtered and its shields flickered, the system struggling to stay online. "Direct hit," Ramirez yelled. "It's losing power, they're in disarray." Carter didn't waste a second. "Fire everything else at the bridge, take them out." The Seraph unleashed everything it had. The ship's remaining lasers and torpedoes fired in rapid succession, hitting the Draxari flagship with precision. The bridge of the Draxari ship exploded in a shower of sparks, and the once mighty vessel faltered, drifting in space, its communications silent. The Draxari fleet was thrown into chaos. Their formation crumbled, their ships suddenly vulnerable as they tried to regain control. The tide of battle had shifted, and humanity had the upper hand. "Now's our chance," Jacobs shouted, his voice filled with excitement. "The rest of their fleet is disoriented. We can take them out before they regroup." Carter nodded, her eyes locked onto the screen. The Draxari were confused, but they were also fast learners. They wouldn't stay disorganized for long. The Seraph had to strike hard and fast. "Move in," Carter ordered. "Ramirez, focus fire on the Draxari ships in the rear. We'll cripple their supply lines first." With a mighty roar, the Seraph dove into the heart of the Draxari fleet, its weapons firing with deadly accuracy. One by one, Draxari ships exploded in brilliant bursts of light, their hulls torn apart by the concentrated firepower. The crew moved like a well-oiled machine, each person working in perfect harmony as they dismantled the fleet piece by piece. But as they continued their assault, Carter knew that time was running out. The Draxari weren't going to sit idly by while their forces were decimated. They would strike back with everything they had. "Captain," Jacobs warned, his voice tight. "They're realigning their forces. They're coming for us and they're bringing reinforcements." Carter's heart raced, but she didn't panic. She couldn't afford to. "We've taken out their command vessel, but we still have work to do. Ramirez, keep up the pressure. Target their supply ships and their remaining heavy artillery." "We're hitting them where it hurts," Ramirez replied, his voice steady. The Seraph danced through the chaos, its weapons lighting up the darkened void. Each shot was a calculated strike, each movement a calculated risk. The Draxari were regrouping, but it would take them time, and time was something they didn't have. Carter's eyes scanned the battlefield, her mind working faster than ever. The Draxari fleet was regrouping, but they weren't all firing at once. There was a gap in their formation, a weakness. "Jacobs," Carter said, her voice sharp. "Can you get us into that gap? I want us in the thick of it." Jacobs didn't hesitate. "Aye, Captain, engaging now." The Seraph surged forward again, its engines roaring as it dove into the heart of the enemy formation. For a moment it seemed like everything would fall apart, but then, as if by sheer will, the ship broke through. The Draxari fleet's defensive fire faltered, and the Seraph tore through, its weapons destroying ship after ship in a chain reaction. "Direct hits," Ramirez shouted. "Their ships are going down one after another." But Carter's attention was on the viewscreen, where the remaining Draxari ships were beginning to regroup. The battle wasn't over, not yet. There were still too many of them, and they were closing in. "Prepare for one last push," Carter said, her voice filled with resolve. "We hit them with everything we've got, full power to the weapons." With one final surge, the Seraph fired everything it had. The remaining Draxari ships were no match for the relentless assault. The Seraph's disruptor beams cut through their defenses, followed by a barrage of laser fire and missiles. The space around them lit up with the explosions of defeated ships, the once feared Draxari fleet now crumbling into nothing. When the final ship fell, silence settled over the battlefield. The crew, battered and bruised, watched as the Draxari fleet was no more. It was over, for now. Carter exhaled deeply, her hands still gripping the controls. She had led them through the impossible, and they had won. Against all odds, humanity had fought back and proven that they were not to be underestimated. "Captain," Jacob said, his voice quieter now, "we did it. We actually did it." Carter nodded, her eyes on the remains of the Draxari fleet. "Yes, we did, but this isn't the end. The Draxari will be back, and when they return, we'll be ready." Her crew stood behind her, stronger than ever. They had faced the impossible, and together, they had shown the galaxy what humanity could do. The Seraph drifted silently through the wreckage of the Draxari fleet. The stars beyond the shattered hulls of enemy ships seemed distant, cold. The crew was silent, still processing the battle they had just fought. Captain Alex Carter stood in the command center, her eyes fixed on the viewscreen, watching the last remnants of the enemy fleet scatter into the void. They had won for now. But she knew the truth. This was just the beginning. "Captain, the damage reports are coming in," Jacob said, his voice breaking the silence. "The ship is holding together, but we're going to need extensive repairs. The engines are damaged and our weapons systems are barely functional." Carter sighed, running a hand over her face. "I know, we've barely made it through, but we need to be ready for what comes next. Earth's not safe yet. The Draxari will regroup and will be their next target. This is only a temporary victory." She turned away from the screen, meeting Jacob's gaze. "We need to focus on what we can control right now. Start repairs immediately. I want the Seraph at full strength in the next 48 hours. Jacobs nodded, already pulling up the ship's diagnostics. "Aye, Captain, I'll get the team on it." The crew had fought with everything they had, but the battle was only the first chapter of what would be a long, hard war. The Draxari weren't going to give up easily. Carter knew that better than anyone. They were a race built for conquest. They wouldn't stop until they had Earth under their control, and the Seraph and its crew were their primary obstacle. The victory they just won. It was a temporary setback. They were going to have to be ready for the next round. Meanwhile, in the engineering bay, Leela Carter, no relation to the captain, was working with her team. The scientist had barely left the control room during the battle, and now she was buried in a pile of Draxari technology they had salvaged. If there was anything that could give them an advantage in the coming fight, it would be this tech. "Captain," Leela said, walking into the command center after a few hours. Her hair was disheveled and she was clearly tired, but her eyes were sharp with focus. "We've started working on the Draxari tech. Some of it, like their weapon systems, is far more advanced than we anticipated, but there's potential here. We can reverse engineer some of their tech and integrate it into the Seraph. It'll give us the edge we need." Carter looked up at her, her eyes filled with determination. "How long until we can make it work?" Leela hesitated. "It's going to take time, Captain, maybe a few weeks. The tech is complex and we're still figuring out how to adapt it to our systems. But we can start with their weapons. If we can power them down, we might be able to stop their fleet's advance before they even get close." Carter took a deep breath. "All right, we don't have a few weeks, but start with what we can. Give us anything we can use in the next battle." Leela nodded and turned to leave, but then stopped. "Captain, there's something else. I've been looking into the Draxari command structure. I think we've underestimated their intelligence. Their fleet's coordination during the battle, it wasn't just brute force. They're calculating. They're waiting for us to make a mistake." Carter's heart sank. The Draxari were ruthless, but now they were also smart. "We won't give them that chance," she said, her voice firm. "We'll strike first when they regroup, But we'll be smarter this time. We'll use everything we have to stay one step ahead." As the crew worked tirelessly to make repairs, Carter remained on the bridge, coordinating their efforts and keeping watch over the communications. The Draxari would strike again, that much was certain. But this time, humanity would be ready. They had learned from their first victory. They had learned how to strike fast, how to use their limited resources to their advantage. They had proven they could fight back, but now they needed to prove they could win the war. Carter stood before the crew, her face set with determination. The battle they had fought earlier was nothing more than a single wave in a much larger storm. The Draxari were not going to leave them alone. It would take more than just one fight to turn the tide in their favor. It would take everything. "We've proven we can win," Carter said, addressing the crew. "We've proven we can stand against the strongest enemy the galaxy has ever known. But now we have to be smarter. We have to be faster. The Draxari won't wait for us to recover. They'll come for us again, and this time they'll be ready." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the crew. "But we're not going to wait for them. We're going to strike before they can regroup. We're going to use their own tactics against them, and we're going to fight for Earth." There was a fire in the eyes of her crew now, the same fire that had carried them through the battle. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their homes, for their families, for humanity. "We're not just survivors," Carter continued, her voice unwavering. "We're warriors, and we're going to show the Draxari exactly what that means." As the crew continued working, Carter allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She stood at the observation deck, staring out into the vastness of space. Earth felt so far away, a distant memory that was fading with every passing moment. But the planet was still there, still home, and it was worth fighting for. The war was far from over. The Draxari were a powerful enemy, and their first defeat would only fuel their anger. But Carter knew one thing: humanity had something the Draxari didn't. They had heart. They had the will to survive, and as long as they had that, they had a chance. The Seraph had come a long way since its launch. It had been a ship of exploration, meant to carry humanity into the stars. But now it was a symbol of their defiance, a symbol of their strength, and under Carter's leadership, it would carry humanity into the next phase of the war. They would take the fight to the Draxari. They would make them regret underestimating humanity. As Carter turned away from the window, the crew was already preparing for the next strike. The Seraph was ready. The crew was ready. And now humanity would face its greatest challenge yet. But this time, they would do it on their terms. Captain Alex Carter stood at the bridge of the Seraph, staring at the stars that stretched endlessly before her. The quiet hum of the ship's engines filled the room, a stark contrast to the chaos of the battle they had just survived. The crew had worked tirelessly to repair the damage, and now, with the ship functional again, they were ready. But as Carter looked out into the vastness of space, she knew that the hard part was just beginning. The Draxari fleet would regroup. They would come for Earth again, and this time they would be even more determined. Carter had no illusions. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving humanity's place in the galaxy, that Earth wasn't a footnote in the universe's history. Humanity was strong, resilient, and ready to fight for its future. "Captain," Jacob said, his voice breaking through her thoughts, "we've intercepted a Draxari transmission. They're calling for reinforcements from the outer colonies. They're going to hit us harder next time." Carter clenched her fists at the news. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Jacobs replied. "Maybe a day or two before they arrive in full force." Carter's mind raced as she turned to face her crew. "We can't let them take Earth. We have to strike first. We can't wait for them to get organized. We hit them hard before they have time to react." The crew nodded. Each of them had seen the devastation the Draxari could cause. They had seen entire worlds fall to their invasion. But humanity wasn't going to let Earth fall the same way. "Ramirez," Carter said, "prepare the disruptor weapons. We're going to take out their supply ships and their reinforcements before they arrive." "Aye, Captain," Ramirez replied, his voice steady. "Weapons are ready. I'll get them online." Carter turned to Jacobs. "Start plotting a course for their reinforcements. We're going to strike fast and hard." The Seraph moved quickly through space, its engines humming with purpose. The crew worked in perfect harmony, their focus sharp, their nerves steady. The past few days had been exhausting, but they were all fueled by the same resolve. They had to keep fighting. They couldn't afford to fail. "We're approaching the Draxari supply line," Jacob said, his voice low with concentration. "We've got 3 Draxari vessels in the area. They're heavily armed, but we can take them out if we hit fast." "Good," Carter said, her voice firm. "Let's make this quick." The Seraph powered forward, slipping through the darkness of space, its weapons charged and ready. Carter felt the familiar weight of the command chair beneath her, the steady thrum of the ship vibrating through her body. She was used to this, used to the responsibility, the pressure. But this time it felt different. This wasn't just about saving a ship. This was about saving Earth. The first Draxari ship came into view, its dark form cutting through the void. The ship was large, heavily armored, but it wasn't enough to stop the Seraph. Carter's fingers moved swiftly over the controls, issuing the command to fire. The disruptor beam shot forward, hitting the Draxari vessel with a bright flash of energy. The ship's shields flickered before failing completely, leaving it vulnerable. "Targeting their engines," Ramirez called, his voice calm under pressure. The Seraph's weapons locked onto the Draxari ship's weak spot, sending out another barrage of energy blasts. The ship exploded in a burst of flames, its hulking form crumpling into debris. The crew let out a collective breath. 1 down, 2 to go. Carter's eyes never left the screen. The second Draxari ship was already turning toward them, weapons primed. It was fast, and its shields were already at full power. But Carter wasn't concerned. They had the advantage of surprise, and they weren't about to waste it. "Ramirez," she said, "hit them with everything we've got. Full power to the disruptor beam." "Aye, Captain," Ramirez replied, his fingers moving with precision. The Seraph's disruptor fired again, the pulse of energy slamming into the Draxari ship's hull. The shields flickered but held strong. Carter's jaw tightened. They couldn't afford a prolonged fight. They had to finish this fast. "Jacobs," Carter barked, "take us in closer. We need to get through those shields." The Seraph dove forward, heading directly into the line of fire. The Draxari ship opened fire, sending a wave of plasma blasts toward them. The Seraph shook violently as the blasts hit, the ship groaning under the impact. "Shields are holding at 30%, Jacobs shouted. "Brace for impact," Carter ordered, gripping the arms of her chair. "Ramirez, fire again." The disruptor beam shot out once more, this time targeting the Draxari ship's engines. The ship screamed as the pulse of energy ripped through its systems, cutting off its power. It struggled for a moment, then exploded in a brilliant flash of light. 2 down, Ramirez said, his voice filled with relief. 1 more to go. But the last Draxari ship wasn't backing down. It was charging directly at them, weapons firing relentlessly. The crew held their breath, the sound of explosions filling the air as the Seraph dodged and weaved, narrowly avoiding the blasts. "We can't keep this up," Jacob said, his hands working furiously at the controls. "If they get a clean shot at our engines, we're done for." "We're not done yet," Carter said, her voice fierce. "We're going to end this now." With a burst of speed, Carter had the Seraph perform a sharp turn, bringing the ship behind the Draxari vessel. The enemy ship, not expecting the maneuver, was caught off guard. Ramirez fired again, this time hitting the Draxari ship's weapons array. The blast sent a shockwave through the ship, disabling it entirely. The Draxari ship began to drift, its systems failing one by one. It was over. "Victory, Captain," Ramirez said, his voice filled with triumph. Carter allowed herself a small smile, but she knew the fight wasn't over. They had won this battle, but there would be more. The Draxari would return with reinforcements and they would come for Earth again. But this time, they would be ready. "Start preparing the ship for the next attack," Carter ordered, standing up from her seat. "We've got no time to waste. Earth needs us." The crew didn't question her. They were already moving, already working as a unit. Humanity had proven that it could survive against impossible odds. And now they were proving something even more important. They could fight, and they could win. Carter turned back to the viewscreen, watching the wreckage of the Draxari fleet float in the darkness. They had taken down 3 of their ships, but the war wasn't over. The Draxari were relentless and they would not stop until Earth was theirs. But as long as humanity had the strength to fight, they would not give up. Not without a fight. The stars outside the Seraph's observation window felt cold, distant. Captain Alex Carter stood before it, her gaze fixed on the vast emptiness. The battle had been hard-won, but she knew it wouldn't last. The Draxari were relentless, and as their ships drifted into the void, a sense of unease settled over her. They had only just begun to recover from the damage. The ship had been patched up, but repairs were far from complete. The crew, though exhausted, had performed miracles to keep the Seraph operational. But the question lingered. How long could they keep this up? How long before the Draxari regrouped and returned, even stronger than before? "Captain, you need to see this." Jacob's voice cut through her thoughts. Carter turned, walking briskly toward the command center. The tension in Jacob's voice was unmistakable. She didn't need to ask what was wrong. She could feel it deep in her gut. The fight wasn't over. As she stepped into the room, Jacobs quickly handed her a data pad. The screen showed the Draxari fleet, or what was left of it, moving back into formation, but it wasn't just their ships. There were new ships coming from deep space. Reinforcements. "They're coming in full force, Captain," Jacobs said, his eyes dark with concern. "They've gathered every available ship. They'll be here in hours, not days." Carter's stomach twisted. She had hoped they'd have more time, but the Draxari weren't known for giving their enemies a break. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the rising storm inside her. 50 ships, possibly more," Jacobs replied, his fingers tapping against the console as he inputted new data. "They'll be here faster than we can prepare." Carter's mind raced. They couldn't fight 50 Draxari ships, not with what they had left. But there was no other choice. They had to make a stand, and they had to make it count. "Get me a full status update," she ordered. "We need to know what we're working with. Shields, weapons, everything." As Jacobs worked, Carter looked around the command room. Her crew was on edge, but their resolve was stronger than ever. They had fought for Earth, and now they were going to fight for survival. She could see it in their eyes. They weren't ready to give up. "Shields are at 60%, Captain," Jacobs said after a moment. "Weapons are at 40%. We've got enough to take a few ships down, but it won't be enough for a full-on assault. We'll have to outsmart them, use their own tactics against them." Carter nodded. "We don't have the luxury of time, so we'll have to act fast. Get the disruptor beams ready. And I want every crew member on high alert. We're about to face the biggest fight of our lives." The next few hours were a blur of activity. The crew worked tirelessly, preparing the ship for the incoming battle. Every person had a role, every hand busy with some task that would help them survive. Leela was in the engineering bay, still working on reverse engineering the Draxari tech. She was pushing her team harder than Carter had ever seen, but the scientist's focus was unwavering. If there was any chance of making their tech even remotely comparable to the Draxari's, Leela would make it happen. Meanwhile, Ramirez was double-checking the weapons systems, ensuring that everything was functioning at maximum capacity. His face was grim as he worked, but Carter could see the determination in his eyes. He wasn't just maintaining the ship's guns, he was preparing for the storm that was coming. The crew had become more than just a team. They had become a family. They fought together, worked together, and, if it came to it, they would die together. But they weren't going to give up without showing the galaxy just what humanity could do. Hours passed and the Draxari fleet drew closer. The tension on the Seraph was unbearable. Carter stood in the control room, her eyes fixed on the approaching enemy. She could see the massive ships, their weapons bristling with power, their shields glowing ominously. There was no doubt in her mind. This would be the toughest fight they'd ever face. But Carter wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. The crew was ready. They had proven that they could survive against impossible odds. Now they had to prove they could win. "Captain, we've got incoming," Jacobs called, his voice calm despite the urgency in the air. "They're within firing range." Carter took a deep breath and turned to face her crew. "This is it," she said, her voice firm. "We fight with everything we've got. No retreat, no surrender." The crew nodded in unison. They knew what was at stake. They had made it this far, and now they would make the Draxari regret ever thinking they could conquer Earth. "Ramirez, target the lead ship. We hit them hard and fast before they can get organized." "Aye, Captain," Ramirez replied, his fingers flying over the weapon's controls. The Seraph's weapons flared to life, sending powerful blasts toward the Draxari flagship. The shots hit the ship's shields with a resounding crash, sending ripples of energy through the space around them. The flagship shuddered, but it didn't go down. The Draxari were tougher than that. But Carter wasn't done yet. "Jacobs, get us closer. We need to keep them off balance." The Seraph lurched forward, cutting through space with calculated speed. They weren't going to win this battle by sheer firepower. But if they could stay on the move, if they could stay unpredictable, they might just have a shot. "Brace for impact," Jacobs shouted as the Draxari fired back. The Seraph rocked as enemy blasts hit their shields, but they held strong. Barely. Carter gritted her teeth. "Keep pushing forward. We can't let them regroup." The crew worked in perfect sync, moving the ship through the chaos, firing weapons and dodging enemy fire. It was a dance of survival. Each shot, each maneuver brought them closer to victory. But the Draxari were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to finish what they had started. The Seraph dove into the heart of the Draxari fleet, its weapons blazing. The enemy ships were firing from all directions, but the crew of the Seraph wasn't backing down. They fought back with everything they had, using every trick, every advantage they had gained to stay one step ahead. As the Seraph continued its assault, Carter knew they couldn't keep up this pace forever. The ship was taking hits, the crew was tired, and the Draxari weren't going to give up. But they weren't giving up either. They had a mission. They had a purpose. And no matter what happened, they would keep fighting. The Draxari fleet was in disarray, their ships falling one by one as the Seraph tore through their ranks. But even as victory seemed within their grasp, Carter knew that the war was far from over. This was just one battle in a larger war. The crew had proven themselves. They had fought with everything they had. And now they had to show the galaxy that humanity wasn't just a small, fragile species. They were warriors. They were survivors. And no one would ever underestimate them again.